and spokesman for former First Lady Jill Biden, and Mark Short, the former White House Director of Legislative Affairs in the first Trump administration. He's also a Meet the Press contributor. Got so much to unpack there. Tia, let's talk about this crime issue, right? This is something that Republicans have often used as a way to demonstrate differences between Republicans and Democrats. Is the president's goal here maybe to get caught trying, like kind of throw everything at the wall? Maybe some of it gets tossed out in court, but try and demonstrate that Republicans are the ones that are going to keep you safe?
I don't know, because I don't know what real effort he's putting into meeting crime where it exists in cities like Washington, in cities like Chicago. We've seen a lot of the effort here in D.C., for example, not in the highest crime areas. And quite frankly, the approach isn't necessarily the best practices or what the people who live in these neighborhoods have asked for when it comes to how to address the root causes of crime. They don't necessarily just want police marching through their streets with guns. They do want jobs and programs to get particularly young black men off the streets in cities like D.C. and Chicago. So I think a lot of it is for show, and a lot of it, quite frankly, is a distraction. We know there are other things that are on the table that, quite frankly, are what Donald Trump says was his mandate when he was elected back, last year, when he took office in January. Those are not the things he's talking about right now, and I think that's really the disconnect.
But, Michael, it could be dangerous for Democrats, though, right? I mean, whenever you talk about law enforcement and crime and punishment, that's an area where Democrats sometimes are uncomfortable talking.
Yeah, absolutely. This is not a hill I would want Democrats to be dying on. Joe Biden wrote probably the toughest crime bill. Back in 1994, he was reelected 3 times. Bill Clinton didn't lose an election ever by being tough on crime, and he certainly was. But we talked about how we need to meet voters where they are. The president probably feels very emboldened, since I think every county in the country went a little redder. As a Democrat, I feel like this is what the people who voted for him voted for. He talked all the time about the cities and the crime waves, and even if you live in D.C., there's a difference between feeling informed and being informed when it comes to crime, because nobody feels safe here, even Democrats and members of the press or anybody else who's down here.
So, Mark, at what point, though, does it become overkill for Republicans? The idea of walking down the National Mall and seeing a National Guardsman with a long gun does begin to get this feeling of a creeping militarized state. At what point are you winning the argument on being tough on crime, but then going a step too far and making people feel uncomfortable that the government is encroaching too much?
Well, I think that the scourge of violent crime in our inner cities is a big liability for Democrats. I think the president's going to keep trying to highlight that and show the contrast. I think having the federalization of the D.C. police here in D.C. and National Guard, I think it's been a smart move. And I think you've seen a dramatic drop in crime in the last 2 weeks and no homicides. And so even though you cite numbers that say violent crime is down 20-some%, the reality is if D.C. were state, it would still have the highest homicide rate in the country.
And at least here in D.C., we know some of the officials, some senior officials in the D.C. police departments have been fudging the numbers a bit, and they're under investigation. And we don't know how many leaders have been changing the stats.
Let me answer your question, Ron, because I do think where it goes too far is I think there's an exception for D.C. It's the nation's capital, and constitutionally there is a role for federal government oversight of D.C. Right. I think when you go to other cities, there are mayors, there are governors, and there's ability for them to call on the National Guard or ask the federal government for help. And I think from a federalist perspective, that's a different step than what you're doing here in Washington, D.C.
I also think it's important for us to be honest about where crime in D.C. exists. We're in D.C. right this minute. We're sitting in D.C. We're surrounded by the tourist areas. Did you all feel unsafe when you walked into this building today? Did you see anything when you walked into this building today? And so my question is, or my concern is, we don't talk about crime in a nuanced way. We don't talk about the fact that there are pockets of this city that are higher in crime, but it's not the whole city. And also, just because crime exists doesn't mean the city is a war zone. But if we talk about it in absolutes, then that erases the real conversations that could be happening about why crime exists where it does in cities like Washington.
Crime is down across the board the last couple of weeks in all parts of D.C.
And it has been a very unpredictable pattern. It's not in the pockets of the city where there has traditionally been crime. Yes, there's been hijackings in Georgetown. There has been people shot in their cars and murdered in downtown at the convention center for simply double parking and picking up their spouse.
Right.
I mean, it's been terrible.
So I think that I don't think that anyone would ignore the idea or downplay the idea that there's a crime problem, but is the solution National Guard troops patrolling the streets? I mean, maybe in an 11-day window, Mark, you're going to make it a little bit better, but you cannot have National Guard troops patrolling up and down Washington, D.C. for how long? How long can you do that? I mean, the Constitution says 30 days, but
that's fair.
I mean, to Tia's point, how do you address the root causes? And is either party been willing to stand up and address those root causes?
Well, let's hope. Hopefully, the mayors and the cities will start working with the president on the root causes instead of fighting the president at every turn. It might be better for the cities, for their constituents, to be working with the federal government on how they can address the root causes.
All right, Mark, I want to play a little bit about what Vice President J.D. Vance told Kristen about this issue this weekend. Take a listen.
At least 6 Republican states are sending in their own National Guard troops as reinforcement. But many of these states have cities that actually have crime rates that are worse than Washington, D.C. So why aren't these states sending National Guard troops into their own states to deal with the crime issue?
Well, look,
and is that a possibility?
Well, look, if the local governors want to make that determination, we'll leave it up to the local governors. But what we have control over is the nation's capital.
I think this kind of leads to the point that you were making, right, Mark? Like Washington, D.C. is one thing, but he seems to talk about these Democratic-led cities. So the Republican governors get to choose, but the Democratic governors don't?
Exactly right. I mean, that's my perspective. I think that D.C. is exceptions, our nation's capital. And again, constitutionally, there is a federal government oversight of the city. I think some of those data points, when you say like Jackson, Mississippi, it's a much smaller scale than what's happening in Chicago.
But they're per capita numbers.
When you say the per capita numbers, the relative homicide rate is still very different. Having said that, I still think from a federalist perspective, it is up to the governor of the state to call the National Guard and not for the federal government to deploy it.
I just want to point out, you talk about where should mayors cooperate. The mayor of D.C., Mayor Bowser, was quite frankly bending over backwards to cooperate with the Trump administration since he took office in January. She faced a lot of heat from her constituents for doing things like dismantling Black Lives Matter. And still the federal government didn't come in as a partner. It forced this upon the city. So you can't say in this current posture the mayor wasn't trying to be as cordial as she could with the White House. And it still is not something that came as a collaboration. Now, they've tried to position it as a collaboration and message it as a collaboration after the fact, but even that has been, somewhat painful for the mayor because people wanted to see her fight this more and quite frankly don't know where the federal government's decision-making begins and the D.C. government's decision-making ends. It's been quite confusing.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you guys all for being
Thanks,
here.
Ron.
Tia, Michael, Mark, great conversation. Coming up, he was mistakenly deported to El